Welcome to Click for IB Biology. We're looking at the topic of diversity of organisms, and in this particular video, we'll be taking on the species concept. There's a PDF of this presentation, which is linked in down below in the description, and you can download that, annotate that with your own notes, and then after that, why not take the 10-question quiz to check your understanding, and then again, solidify that by checking the answers which are down there as well. So the species concept and the diversity of organisms. The first attempt at cataloguing the diversity of organisms was attempted by Carl Linnaeus back in the 1700s, and Carl is known as the father of taxonomy. He created this hierarchical classification system in which there's kingdom, class, order, genus, and species. And of course, we would know that within a particular genus, it's possible to have a number of species, a number of genus within an order, and a number of orders within the class. A kingdom can contain many classes. So this is a classification system, an ordering system, which was introduced by Carl Linnaeus. An important part of Linnaeus's work was his attaching to each species what is known as a binomial nomenclature, a binomial name. And of course, as the name implies, bi meaning two, there are two components to this naming system, and this system is still in place today. The first part of the naming system is the genus. Here you can see that we're actually operating on the human species name, Homo sapiens, and can I draw your attention, very important, to the fact that the genus has capitalization of the first letter. The species epithet, the species component to the name, has sapiens, S, has lowercase letter, so the species component here, that must have the lowercase letter. And this is an important protocol that you should observe when typing and indeed when writing. It is also the case that when one is actually using typing, one should, in principle, italicize species names in your writing. So Linnaeus named his the organisms with which he was able to catalogue, and they largely fell under two kingdoms that he identified as the kingdom of plants and the kingdom of animals, and he used morphological features to distinguish one species from the other. Particularly in plants, he would be using reproductive features such as the number of carpel, the number of stamen, the petal arrangement and structure. Whilst in the animals, he was concerned with the symmetry of the form of the animal, the arrangement of a number of limbs, and of course their skeletal structure. And he used these in order to create kingdoms, classes, orders, genus, and species of animals and plants. The Linnaean system was uprated, as it were, in 1942. We had the contribution of the great evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr. He introduced what many of us will know as the species definition. This is actually the biological species concept. And this concept has the idea that we have reproductive isolation of one group from another, and that in those reproductively groups, they in here are producing fertile offspring. So I'm referring to population A and population B. They're reproductively isolated from each other and producing fertile offspring within their populations. And for Mayr, that was his definition of a species. It's not without its challenges. For instance, this doesn't help us when it comes to the classification of asexually reproducing organisms, as fertility is not an issue in these particular groups, as they are not producing gametes or going through random fertilization. Fossil species, of course, whilst they may give us lots of information, cannot give us information about their reproductive success. Hybridization is an issue in the biological species concept. The idea is that if you have two species and they hybridize, then their offspring would be infertile. And we do come across a number of examples that we've noted in other parts of this course. Most famously, perhaps, we could have the horse and the donkey producing the mule, and the mule being an infertile hybrid. And so that would tend to support the biological species concept. But of course, it's necessary to attempt to breed these hybrids in order to confirm the reproductive isolation. Now, in domesticated animals, that's straightforward, but in in wild animals, that would be much more of a challenge. The same idea is found in allopatric species, where if you've covered this work, you'll know that in allopatric species, we have this geographically introduced barrier to the population. And then we have a population on this side. Let's call that A, and then let's call that B. For instance, you might recall that we looked at the idea of the allopatric speciation of chimpanzees into the chimpanzee and the bonobos chimpanzee with the introduction of the Congo River about 2 million years ago. Now, do we know that they are actually reproductively isolated from each other? And the case of the chimp and the bonobos is a case example where there are operational challenges with confirming that these truly are species. To carry out reproductive experimentalization of breeding a chimp with a bonobos chimp would be regarded as unethical experimental work. So there are operational challenges to the biological species. Simply establishing that a population is actually not reproducing, or that their hybrids are not infertile, is something of a challenge. There are other species concepts that you may have come across. The one used, of course, by Linnaeus and indeed by most field biologists is the morphological species concept, where you use physical characteristics in order to identify species. And this is successful in as far as we believe that we're identifying species, but here's an example where this becomes challenged. These birds here are all members of a group known as the Phylogenetic warblers. And whilst there are small physical differences between these birds, it's actually a challenge to the morphological species concept, as these challenges are very, very difficult to observe and distinguish in the field. Other than their physical characteristics, specialists in identifying phylogenetic warblers would use behavioral characteristics as well, and those would tend to move to our second species concept, which is the ecological species concept, which is based on defining a species in terms of the niche in which it's occupying. And this is often used by field experts to distinguish between these types of birds here based on their location rather than their physical characteristics. For most people, you can't tell two of these birds apart, but you might choose to do so based on the location in which you're actually observing these birds. So morphological species concept and ecological species concept combined together give you a very good field tool for the identification of species. However, we can never be sure in such classification whether or not we actually do have two genetically distinct species, and this is what we call the phylogenetic species concept, where we establish that two populations, despite having very similar morphological, ecological features, that at the genetic level we would be able to distinguish between them. Were we able to obtain DNA in order to carry out? But that, of course, leads to another challenge to any type of classification where it's necessary to obtain biological material in order to establish that we do indeed have a species. So these are species concepts and some of the challenges to the species concept. And so we'll go on now in the next video to look at more of these challenges to the species concept. There's a chance to subscribe to the channel and our Organisms and Diversity playlist for your ease of access. Thank you very much for watching. Please do subscribe.